Night had fallen over the city like an iron curtain, thick, wet, heavy with a silence that knew too much. Rain hammered the awning of the old Ruby's diner like impatient fingers, and inside, under red lights that seemed to bleed over the steel, a single engine roared and fell silent. The door opened, letting in the smell of gasoline, open road, and danger. He walked in with slow, heavy steps, marked by years that do not forgive. And in that instant, when the waitress saw him, she knew that this night would not be like the others. Because before she set the check on the table, she leaned in, whispered something in his ear, and those few words forced him to change everything. Stay till the end, because this story proves that brotherhood roars louder than fear. Her name was Grace Holloway, and she had reached a point in her life where exhaustion was no longer a feeling, but a permanent shadow clinging to her back. A silent presence that reminded her every night that she was living more than her body could endure. Ruby's Diner was the place where she spent most of her days, and yet she never truly felt like she was there. It was her home because she had nowhere else to go, and it was her prison because every shift ended up reminding her that freedom had always been far out of reach. The sound of the coffee machine, that sharp and constant hiss, had replaced the heartbeat of her hope. It was a painful reminder that in that forgotten corner of the map, nobody dreamed. They simply survived. Grace worked endless nights, nights that felt like a single unbroken block with no beginning and no end, serving tired travelers, truckers without families, lost souls searching for warmth and a hot plate of food or a brief conversation, even though she barely had the strength to hold anything more than coffee cups. She did it all with a smile that was no longer hers, with an automatic kindness that hid the tremor that took over her chest every time she thought about going back home. Because for weeks, something dark had slipped into her life. A man was following her. He wasn't a regular customer. He wasn't a neighbor. He had no name, no clear face, only the blurred shape of a threat moving in the shadows. Sometimes she saw him reflected in the diner's windows, a motionless figure standing under the rain, a pair of eyes glowing out of the darkness, the fogged glass showing just the faint outline of a body that vanished the moment someone else turned to look. She saw him so many times that she stopped wondering if it was a coincidence. And she felt him so close, so attached to her routine, that she began to fear that fear itself would become a permanent part of who she was. She went to the police. She spoke to neighbors. She asked anyone who would listen for help. But in that small town, where every secret hid under layers of silence and convenience, no one wanted to get involved in problems that weren't theirs. "You're imagining things," they told her. "Long nights make you see ghosts," they insisted. But Grace knew the truth. There was a man out there, watching her, following her, waiting for something. That night, when the diner lights flickered because of the storm, fate walked in under a rainfall that seemed intent on erasing the world. A biker crossed the door, soaked from head to toe, his black vest marked by patches that spoke of unforgiving roads, violent nights, stories no one in that town would have dared to hear. His presence filled the place with a different weight, solid, real, as if the storm outside had taken human form just to sit at a table. Grace saw him, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel fear. She felt a flicker of opportunity. Something inside her, small but intense, told her that this night didn't have to end like the others. With her pulse trembling beneath the tray, she walked up to the biker's table and set the coffee in front of him. The cup shook slightly as it touched the metal. Grace swallowed hard, leaned toward him, and with a voice cracking like glass under pressure, she whispered, "I think someone's following me, and I don't know if I'm going to make it home tonight." The man lifted his gaze, and in that instant, without a single extra word, that's where it all began. The man lifted his gaze with an almost ritual slowness, as if every inch his eyes rose carried the weight of years marked by difficult decisions, endless roads, and nights where danger and uncertainty had been as constant as the air he breathed. And that way of looking, calm and firm at the same time, revealed the kind of person he was. Someone who recognized in another person's fear a truth so deep it did not need words to be understood. His name was Cole Maddox, a veteran of a chapter that avoided lights, gossip, and the superficial noise of the world, always preferring discretion, the open road, and a code of honor passed down in silence from generation to generation. A code that was never recited aloud, yet was carved into the skin and spirit of each one of them. On his face, there were long, old scars that demanded no explanation because it was already embedded in their twisted shapes. Scars born in nights so dark. The man lifted his gaze with an almost ritual slowness, as if every inch his eyes rose carried the weight of years, marked by difficult decisions, endless roads, and nights where danger and uncertainty had been as constant as the air he breathed. And that way of looking, calm and firm at the same time, revealed the kind of person he was. Someone who recognized in another person's fear a truth so deep it did not need words to be understood. His name was Cole Maddox, a veteran of a chapter that avoided lights, gossip, and the superficial noise of the world, always preferring discretion, the open road, and a code of honor passed down in silence from generation to generation, a code that was never recited aloud, yet was carved into the skin and spirit of each one of them. On his face there were long, old scars that demanded no explanation because it was already embedded in their twisted shapes. Scars born in nights so dark it was hard to tell where danger ended and life began. Scars that spoke of roads without law, of friendships lost to violence, of decisions made in a single second that marked the years that followed. And in that almost solid silence that surrounded him, there was one rule written deeper than any book or statute. When someone asks for help, you don't turn your back. even if that someone is a stranger, even if the consequence might be a war you never asked for, because brotherhood isn't fed by comfort, but by responsibility. Grace kept moving through the diner with the tired mechanics of someone who has repeated every gesture so many times that she no longer knows where intention ends and survival begins. But although she tried to maintain composure, her hands trembled with a weakness only Cole seemed to notice. A weakness hiding behind trays, cups, and forced smiles, yet exploding in the small details, betraying that something inside her was about to break. Outside, beyond the glass fogged by kitchen steam and raindrops, the neon signs projected uneven flashes over the puddles gathered on the asphalt. And between those distorted reflections, a restless shadow slid, moving at the same rhythm as the storm, in such a subtle way that anyone would have thought it was just a trick of the rain. Anyone except Cole. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask questions. He didn't move. He simply brought the cup to his lips with the dangerous calm of a man who isn't doubting, but evaluating, measuring possibilities, escape routes, levels of threat, as if each sip were another piece in the strategic map he was drawing in his mind to confront something that had not yet happened, but was undeniably approaching. The tension began to condense in the air, almost tangible, as if the entire diner were holding its breath. Then, without warning, the glass vibrated with an almost imperceptible force, a slight tremor, just strong enough to make Cole shift his gaze a few millimeters, just enough to catch the instant when a face appeared from the darkness outside. An incomplete face, only a fragment illuminated by a distant lightning strike, with eyes overflowing with intent and a crooked smile that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the curtain of rain that covered the parking lot. Grace saw it too, and that single moment was enough to shatter her breath into something desperate, forcing her to lean on the counter with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and exhaustion that had been building for weeks. And with a voice so weakened it seemed on the verge of breaking completely, she murmured a whisper that no longer sought explanation, but pure rescue. "He's here again, out there, watching me." Cole tightened his grip on the cup so hard the ceramic cracked, not out of anger, but out of the absolute certainty that the situation had just crossed an invisible line from which there was no return. And although every part of his mind reminded him this wasn't his town, that this woman was a stranger, that this conflict was not his business, the code stitched into his skin weighed more than any rational thought, because that code didn't understand excuses, didn't accept indifference, and never tolerated injustice when it stood right in front of his eyes. And it was in that instant, in that exact second when the storm hammered the diner's roof like a final warning, that Cole understood Grace's whisper had not been a simple confession of fear, nor a nervous remark, nor a phrase thrown into the air, but a distress flare launched from her soul, one that he, for everything he was and represented, could not and would not ignore. Cole rose from the table with a heaviness so dense it seemed to drag along all the noise of the diner, leaving behind the smell of stale coffee and the reddish light trembling over the metal. And as he walked toward the door, he placed a crumpled bill beneath the still warm cup, not as payment, but as a final gesture marking the end of a silent chapter and the beginning of something that was about to wrap the entire night. Stepping outside, the humid air, thick with electricity, hit his face with the rawness of a wind that shook the electric poles until they creaked, blending the smell of the storm with a dense, almost mineral sensation that announced that what was about to happen would not be a simple confrontation, but another chapter in that long story where fear meets brotherhood and finally learns who rules the road. Cole slid his hand into the inner pocket of his vest, the pocket he only used in moments when there was no room for doubt, and pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen, a device that looked as if it had survived as many storms as he had. He didn't need to search for contacts, names, or confirmations. He simply dialed a number his fingers knew by heart, and without hesitation spoke a single line, which to anyone else might sound like a casual request, but in this world meant the whole night was about to change shape. "I need backup." And it was like activating an old line between men who no longer needed explanations. The answer did not come in words, it came in sound. First, a distant engine was heard, deep, like some beast awakening in the darkest part of the highway. Then another joined, lower, closer, followed by a third that made the air vibrate as if the asphalt itself were breathing. In a matter of seconds, 3 engines turned into 5, and 5 into 7, until the entire parking lot was wrapped in a crescendo of metal and controlled fury, a collective roar that seemed to rise from the very shadow of the desert. The Hell's Angels had not come to make noise for its own sake, nor to sow chaos, nor to show off strength without reason. They had come because one of their own had heard a whisper turned into a plea, and that, in their world, was enough to move mountains, to cross entire cities under the rain, to face a fate that preferred to hide among wet cars and flickering lights. When the bikes lined up, night stopped being night. The headlights painted the asphalt in shades of white and gold, and in the middle of that violent contrast, the stalker hidden behind the cars felt something he had never truly felt before: real fear, the kind that doesn't come from physical danger, but from an instinctive recognition that he had been seen, identified, and surrounded by men who do not tolerate injustice or abuse, and who are willing to intervene without asking anyone's permission. Cole walked back toward Grace, who watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and relief that threatened to buckle her legs. He didn't smile, because this wasn't a moment for empty gestures, and he made no promises, because promises depend on the future, and Cole was a man who acted in the present. But what he said carried more weight than any comforting words, because it wasn't a shallow phrase, but a sentence spoken by someone who, once he decides to protect you, does it all the way. "You're not alone anymore." And those 4 words were enough to change the course of the night. If you believe loyalty still matters, subscribe to Hell's Road, because stories like this are only just beginning. The bikers took their positions without needing to speak, as if each one of them knew by heart the silent choreography that can only be learned after years of living on the road, forming a semicircle that wrapped around the parking lot with a presence so solid it seemed to alter the very shape of the night. They didn't draw weapons, didn't make sudden movements, didn't voice threats. They didn't have to, because the simple union of their bodies soaked by the storm, the low rumble of their engines still vibrating in their chests, and the unshakable firmness in their eyes were enough to impose an almost ancestral respect, a respect born not from fear, but from the certainty that these were men who understood loyalty the way others understand survival. Grace watched them from the diner doorway with a mix of disbelief, relief, and awe that pinned her to the floor, unable to fully grasp how a whisper spoken in a moment of desperation had managed to summon a storm of steel, leather, and brotherhood, far more powerful than the real storm still hammering the roof with the fury of a tired sky. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear, now shook with a different emotion, one she hadn't felt in a long time. The sense that someone, finally, was there to protect her without expecting anything in return. Cole, who had remained firm at the center as the axis of that silent formation, adjusted his vest with a simple yet loaded gesture, and when the wet leather tightened over his chest, the embroidered colors, those symbols of loyalty, honor, and memory, shone under the warped neon light as if each stitch held a story, a sacrifice, a road traveled with the conviction that the path is not just walked, it is lived, suffered, and honored. With the rain streaming down his face as if the night itself were trying and failing to erase the determination carved into his gaze, Cole spoke in a voice so steady it seemed to merge with the rumble of the engines behind him. "We're not going to let him follow you. Tonight, it ends." He didn't say it with arrogance or brutality, but with that heavy, grave calm of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to change the course of events. A calm that made Grace feel, for the first time in a long while, that the fear that had haunted her for weeks was beginning to dissolve in the humid air. And as the engines regained strength, roaring from their metallic cores as if they were inhaling the darkness before exhaling justice, a line echoed with cinematic weight that didn't belong only to that moment, but to an entire tradition built over decades at the edges of the asphalt. You can carry this same spirit. Our official Hell's Road gear is linked in the description for those who live by the code. The engines climbed even higher, creating a thunder that made the diner windows vibrate, as if the machines themselves understood they were about to ride into a story that, for Grace, would forever mark a before and after. The air smelled of rain, gasoline, and destiny, and the night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The stalker, who had stayed hidden among the cars, believing himself invisible under the rainfall that fell like a thick curtain, suddenly felt how the presence of the engines and the silent formation of those men turned the night into a stage where he no longer had any escape. And driven by an instinct as primitive as it was useless, he tried to run, pushing himself into the darkness with the desperate clumsiness of someone who knows he's already losing before he even begins to flee. But wet asphalt does not forgive. It never has, and his shoes slipped on the soaked ground, sending him crashing down with a dull thud that blended with distant thunder, forcing him to scramble up in panicked imbalance, rising with his breath broken into fragments, only to realize that, standing, he had placed himself right at the center of a living circle of shadows, 7 deep engines vibrating in unison, 7 still silhouettes under the rain, and 7 gazes capable of stripping away any lie, any excuse, any attempt to hide what he had been doing for weeks. The sound of the engines wasn't just noise, it was a warning, a reminder that he had crossed a line he should never have approached, an ancient boundary guarded by men of the road, not with speeches or empty threats, but with a determination you could feel in the air. And from the middle of that semicircle opening like the jaw of some prehistoric beast, Cole walked toward him, not with violence or shouting, but with a calm so absolute it made the atmosphere denser, heavier, as if every step marked the rhythm of an unavoidable sentence handed down by the brotherhood standing at his back. Cole didn't need to raise his voice, because his presence alone made the world around them seem to slow down, and when he finally spoke, he did it with the controlled force of a silent thunderbolt splitting the rain, a storm that didn't need to roar to destroy. You keep following her, and this night ends much worse for you. You touch her again, you so much as look at her the wrong way, and you won't want to know what happens next. It wasn't an empty threat, nor an exaggerated warning. It was a sentence delivered with the certainty of someone who only intervenes when there is no other option. Someone who only speaks like this when silence would mean letting someone die inside. Every word carried a weight the stalker understood without needing further explanation. A message as clear as a knife laid against the throat of fate. This was his last chance to stop before falling completely. The man, drenched, trembling, his breathing shattered by the panic that had finally reached him, stumbled backwards until his knees gave out and he collapsed onto the ground, unable to support his own weight, letting fear disarm him until it reduced him to something almost childlike. He cried, begged for forgiveness the wind carried away without mercy, raised his hands as if pleading for leniency from a court that had already passed judgment. And between sobs, he swore he would stay away forever, that he would never look at her again, never go near her, never exist in her world again. And the bikers, who could have given him a much harsher lesson, who could have marked him so he'd never forget his mistake, chose instead to pull back with the same solemnity with which they had arrived, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because the true purpose of that night was not to humiliate the man, but to allow Grace to witness with her own eyes something the world so often forgets, that justice doesn't always wear a uniform, that sometimes it moves quietly atop the rumble of a Harley, wrapped in black leather, iron, and brotherhood. Grace, who had watched the entire scene with her heart pounding like a desperate creature trapped inside her chest, felt how the weight she had been carrying for weeks began to crumble. And as she finally understood that she was safe at last, her legs failed her, forcing her to fall to her knees on the wet ground. She did not cry out of fear. She did not cry out of shame. She cried out of relief. A relief so deep that for the first time in a very long time, she felt she could truly breathe again. The Hells Angels moved forward in formation with an almost ritual solemnity, escorting Grace's old Chevy through the narrow, rain-soaked streets, gliding with the silent precision of guardians who know every shadow on the road, every dark curve, every corner where danger might try to rise again. The engines did not roar with violence. They pulsed with a low, steady rhythm, a metallic heartbeat that wrapped the night like a protective cloak. And Grace, driving with hands still shaking on the wheel, watched through the rearview mirror as their red lights reflected on the wet asphalt, drawing a trail that seemed to erase, inch by inch, all the fear that had consumed her for weeks. For the first time in months, she felt her chest open for a clean, deep breath, free from that invisible pain that takes root when fear becomes a constant companion. When they reached the small road leading to her house, the rain had softened enough for Grace to distinguish the outline of her home, a place that had stopped feeling safe long ago, but that tonight seemed reclaimed, protected, almost sacred under the silent presence of those men who weren't looking for applause or gratitude. Cole stopped beside her window, lit by the faint reflection of the headlight, marking a border between the darkness and the newly won calm. He didn't ask for explanations or deliver heroic speeches. He simply inclined his head with a gentleness as unexpected as it was powerful, as if that single gesture were enough to seal a silent pact between them. And with a low, steady voice, filled with the serenity only those who've survived too many hard nights possess, he said, "You're safe. And if you ever hear engines at night, don't be afraid. It might be one of us making sure you're okay." The words hung in the air, mixing with the smell of rain and wet earth, turning into an invisible shield that would stay with her from that moment on. Grace felt that, although the night had been long and cruel, something inside her had changed forever. Some roads lead to redemption, others to memory. If you want to keep the fire alive, the official Hell's Road store is linked below, where brotherhood lives beyond the story.